In our previous video, we were looking at how elasticity of demand, or price elasticity, is a continuum. On one extreme, we have perfectly elastic demand with an elasticity coefficient of infinity. You change the price a little, and there's an infinite amount of change to quantity demanded. People are very sensitive to the price change. On the other extreme, we have perfectly inelastic demand. You change the price, and the amount people are willing and able to buy does not change at all. So the elasticity coefficient is 0. We know from this continuum that if your elasticity coefficient is between 0 and 1, you have inelastic demand. And between 1 and infinity, you have elastic demand. What we want to look at now are the properties or characteristics that would make a particular product more likely to have elastic or inelastic demand. In the activity you did in class, you took the items that you see here and you arranged them from perfectly inelastic to perfectly elastic along the continuum. So you were looking at how they compare to each other. So it's important to know the properties or characteristics that can make something more elastic or inelastic. And it's quite possible for an item to have properties that make it more elastic and properties that make it more inelastic. This will ultimately put it on this continuum closer to that unit elastic, where the elasticity coefficient is 1. But it's also possible to have an item that has a number of properties that make it more elastic, so then it's going to be much further to the right on this continuum. Or it could have lots of properties that make it inelastic, in which case it's much further to the left and has a much lower elasticity coefficient. So we want to look at what these characteristics or properties are that can make an item more elastic or inelastic. There are 6 of what we call determinants of elasticity. These determinants of elasticity make something more elastic or inelastic because a particular good or service can have a different number of substitutes, can have a different nature, number of uses. That's what creates this continuum, because one factor, one determinant might push it more elastic, another determinant might push it more inelastic. So let's break it down and look at these individually. Let's start with the first one, which is the number of substitutes. So the number of substitutes or alternatives will determine how elastic or inelastic something is. For example, let's look at your car. What can you put in your car to make it run? Well, if your car is like my car, gas, right? There's very few substitutes or alternatives. So if there are very few alternatives, if you're trying to get to work today and the price is now double when it comes to the price of gas, what do? Well, you're still going to pay anyway, right? So if there are very few substitutes, how sensitive are you to the price change? The price changes, the amount you're willing to buy will change a lot or change a little. Excuse me. If there are not a lot of alternatives, then when the price changes, you're still going to pay it anyway. So you're not very sensitive to the price change, and so your demand is inelastic. Well, let's look at coffee. What kind of choices do you have for making coffee? So you normally buy Folgers, but what are some alternatives? Starbucks, Tim Hortons, McDonald's, Nabob, Lavazza. There's lots of choices, lots of substitutes. So if the price of Folgers coffee doubles, what will you do? Well, since you have lots of alternatives, you'll just switch to a cheaper brand. So if there are many substitutes, then are we very sensitive to a price change? Not very sensitive to a price change? Well, here we are, very sensitive to the price change. The price changes, the amount we're willing and able to buy changes a lot, like the elastic band. So here we have elastic demand if there are many substitutes. The second determinant of elasticity is the percentage of the budget. So let's suppose you're going to buy a vehicle, a Honda Civic. Okay, and that Honda Civic, let's say $30,000. Now, if you go to the dealership to buy the car, and when you get there, it's no longer $30,000, it's now $60,000, so double. Well, it's now a lot more money, but even at $30,000, it was a big percentage of your budget. So when something is a big percentage of your budget, how sensitive are you to a change in price? Well, that Honda Civic, you're probably going to say, you know what, I'm going to wait until they have a deal at the dealership, right? Until they have employee price savings where they give everybody the same discount that the employees get. You're waiting for the price to fall because you are sensitive to the price. And you are sensitive to the price because it's a big chunk of your budget. So if something is a large percentage, your demand is going to be what? So the price changes, the amount you are willing and able to buy, and this is a collective amount we are willing and able to buy. So you may buy one or none, but other people will as well. So a large percentage of your budget, you're going to be very sensitive to the price change. Your demand is going to be elastic. Now, what about something that's a small percentage of your budget? So let's think about like a pack of matches. And you're probably saying, no one buys packs of matches, right? You go to hotels and bars and you get them for free. Well, a pack of matches is a very small percentage of your budget, right? A pack of matches is less than 50 cents. So not very big percentage. So what if it doubles in price from 50 cents to $1? Still a small percentage of your budget. And so how sensitive are you to the price change? Do you really feel the difference between 50 cents and $1 if they're both very small percentages of your budget? So if something is a small percentage of your budget, you're not very sensitive to that price change. The price will change and the amount you are willing and able to buy, it's not going to change a whole lot. Right? When the matches go on sale from 50 cents to 25 cents, you're not super stocking up. So you have inelastic demand. All right, so we have number of substitutes, percentage of our budget. Number 3 is whether the item is a luxury or a necessity. So let's think about milk. Is milk a luxury or a necessity? Well, if you have small kids at home, then you know that milk is a necessity. So you need it. All right, well, if it's a necessity, you can't live without it. And let's say you normally go and you buy a gallon of milk and it's normally about $3.50, $4. Today you go to get the milk and it's not $4, it's now $8. How sensitive are you to the change in price? Does the amount you're going to buy change a lot or change a little? It'll change some, right? Because $8 for a gallon of milk is a lot of money. But if you have young kids at home, you're probably going to get some anyway. So something that is a necessity that we need, how sensitive are we to the price change? The price changes and the amount we buy changes a lot, so elastic, or the price changes and the amount we buy changes a little. Well, if it's a necessity, it's only going to change a little, so your demand is more inelastic. In comparison, if we have a luxury, okay, something we want but can live without, let's think Caribbean cruise. So you want to go on a Caribbean cruise. You've planned it for the next coming holiday. Last time you checked, the price for the cruise would cost you about $5,000 for your family. Now you go and you're getting ready to book this cruise and the price has doubled. It's now $10,000. Well, you could live without the Caribbean cruise. It's not something you have to have. So that makes you more sensitive to the price, which means your demand is what? It's more elastic. Now, notice when we talk about the Caribbean cruise, it's a luxury, which makes it more elastic. $10,000 is probably a large percentage of your budget, so that makes it more elastic. And there are alternatives, right? There are other places you could go for your vacation besides a Caribbean cruise. So there are a number of substitutes, which makes it more elastic. So if we're thinking about a cruise on that continuum we were looking at before, where would that Caribbean cruise be, right? It'd probably be much higher up here on our continuum and have a much higher elasticity coefficient, because a number of these factors or determinants make it more and more elastic. All right, number 4. Number 4 is number of uses. How many different things can you do with this item? So let's think about a computer, for example. A computer has lots of uses. What are some things that you do on your computer? Right? You're watching these videos, so school. You maybe you watch Netflix, entertainment. Maybe you email or chat with family and friends. Maybe you play video games. There's lots of things we do on a computer. Maybe you have a job and you are doing spreadsheets and organization and typing up reports. So you're doing work on your computer. There's lots of different things that we do on the computer. It has lots of uses. Well, if we went to buy a computer and a computer was now double in price, what would we do? Well, we could find another way to watch Netflix, right? We could watch it on our TV. We could find another way to chat and message friends and family. We could do that on our phone. So there are a number of alternatives, right, that we can find. We can play video games on our Xbox or PlayStation. So the more uses things have, the more likely that each use has an alternative. So our number of uses determinant here is closely tied with the number of substitutes, with the thought being that the more different things a product does, each of those different things probably has a substitute. So something with lots of uses, if we can find alternatives for each use, then what happens is we become a lot more sensitive to the price. When the price of the computer doubles, we think, I can do my work with the old computer and I can find an alternative source for video games and for movies and so on. So things with lots of uses have more elastic demand. We can find an alternative for each. Things that have very few uses, very specialized uses. Okay, so think about AutoCAD. AutoCAD is software for engineers for designing buildings and homes. It has a very specific use. And because it has a very specific and unique use, it's hard to find alternatives that give you that same specific use. So things that have very few or specific uses, then they tend to have less alternatives, and that makes us less likely to be able to find something else when the price changes, and so our demand is more inelastic. Companies know whether demand is elastic or inelastic for their products. Think about Microsoft, for example. Microsoft Word, Excel in particular, has very specific use, right? It does things that other programs don't do. In terms of certain types of graphs and analysis, their Google Sheets and the Mac version as well, they just don't quite compare. So when there are less substitutes, less alternatives, it's going to be more inelastic. When it has a very specific use, it's going to be more inelastic. Okay. If it's a necessity to your job, right? AutoCAD for engineers, Excel spreadsheets for business people, necessity, inelastic. So we're pushing it further on that continuum. Well, the businesses know this, right? When there are not many alternatives, when people can't live without it to do their jobs, businesses know that you are less sensitive to the price change. And since they know you are less sensitive to the price change, what can they do? Well, they can charge a higher price. And that's why things like Microsoft Office have historically been quite expensive, because there are less alternatives. It has very specific use. It's a necessity for business. Now, as we see the competitors start to offer similar features, so if we look at Microsoft Word, and now you have Google Docs and you have the Mac Pages, there are a number of substitutes that provide similar uses. What happens as we move along the continuum, so we were more inelastic, now we're moving this way towards more elastic, more sensitive to the price. And so what happens is Microsoft Office has to then lower its price to be more competitive because it understands now that a higher price doesn't mean the same number of people are going to be still willing to buy. You are now more sensitive to the price because you can find alternatives. So we had substitutes, percentage of the budget, luxury or necessity, number of uses. Number 5 is time period. What kind of time frame are we looking at here? So we talked before about if you were on your way to work and your gas tank was empty and the price of gas had doubled, you would pay anyway. So in a very short term, you can't really change your behavior. So in the short term, you have to get to work, so you're going to pay the higher price anyway. In the short term, our demand is more inelastic. But if you knew the gas prices were going to stay high, what could you do? You could move closer to work. You could live somewhere that has public transit. You could buy a car that was electric or hybrid. So in the long term, given enough time, we can change our behavior. And if we can change our behavior, we can then respond to the price change. So given enough time, demand becomes more elastic. The last determinant of elasticity, so the last thing that makes something more elastic or inelastic, is the breadth of definition. So what is it we are talking about? Are we talking about something that is like brand specific, like an Armani suit? Or are we talking about something much more broad and generic, like clothing? So, Armani suit doubles in price. Well, there are alternatives, right? We're being very specific here. We're talking about a particular brand, which means there are now lots of substitutes. So the more specific we are when we talk about a particular brand, the more sensitive we are to the price. Because if an Armani suit gets too expensive, we can switch to a different brand. So that makes demand, if it's more specific in its breadth of definition, then it's more elastic. Whereas if our definition is very broad, so we talk about all clothing. Well, we talk about all clothing. If clothing doubles in price, all clothing, you're not going to go to work or school naked, so you're going to pay it. So the broader the definition of the product, the more inelastic the demand. We could look at, for example, Kraft dinner. If the price of Kraft dinner doubles, you'll get a different brand. If we're talking about all food, if all food doubles in price, you still have to eat to live, okay? And so you're going to pay it. So we can start to see how these different determinants start to all impact because it's a necessity. We need food to live. It's broadly defined, okay? So these things are making it more and more inelastic. So it's the combination of these 6 factors that can decide where an item is on the continuum. So some of the determinants push it one way, some of the determinants push it another way, which is why we can take products and we can put them in order from inelastic to elastic on this continuum.